Imagine a young man, just 20 years old, newly crowned king of one of the most powerful nations of his time. His name is Solomon. Son of the great King David and Bathsheba, Solomon's name carries the promise of peace. He was born into chaos and conflict, yet he was destined for something great, something that would change the course of Israel's history. As Solomon ascends to the throne, he faces the weight of expectations. His father, David, now old and near death, gives him wise counsel. Be strong, act like a man, and walk in obedience to the Lord. This is the advice that echoes in Solomon's mind as he tries to grasp the immense power now in his hands. He knows he must be more than just a king. He must be a leader, an example, someone who walks with God. Then, something extraordinary happens. One night, as Solomon sleeps, he has a dream that will change his life forever. God appears to him and makes an offer that few could resist. Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it to you. Imagine for a moment what you would ask for if the creator of the universe made this offer to you. Wealth? Power? The defeat of your enemies? Solomon could have asked for anything, but he chose something very different. He asks for wisdom. Aware of his youth and the great responsibility resting on his shoulders, Solomon prays for a wise heart, one that can discern between right and wrong. He doesn't ask for himself, but for the ability to lead God's people with justice. And God, moved by his humility, grants him not only the wisdom he requested but also wealth and honor beyond any king before him. This moment marks the beginning of a reign that will be remembered for generations. Solomon, the young king who asked for wisdom instead of wealth, starts his journey with divine favor and a bright future. He will become the wisest man who ever lived, and his name will be known throughout the earth. But how will this journey of wisdom end? Will he be able to keep his heart faithful to the God who gave him so much? Solomon's wisdom quickly becomes legendary. He resolves complex disputes with disarming simplicity, like the famous case of the two women who both claimed to be the mother of the same baby. With a single sentence, he reveals the truth and exposes the real mother. The people of Israel begin to see Solomon not just as a king, but as a divinely inspired leader, someone whose judgment is unfailing. But what few know is that behind this wisdom, there is a heart silently bearing a heavy burden. When Solomon received the wisdom he asked for, he also received something he couldn't have predicted: the weight of knowledge. His ability to see beyond appearances makes him not only wise but also deeply aware of human flaws and weaknesses, including his own. The wisdom that was once his greatest blessing slowly turns into a double-edged sword. He realizes that being wise doesn't protect him from temptation. Over time, difficult decisions start to pile up. Foreign policies and alliances with other nations bring new challenges. To ensure Israel's peace and prosperity, Solomon begins to form alliances through marriages with foreign princesses, something that initially seemed like mere strategy but gradually begins to turn his heart away from God. The Solomon who once walked closely with God now finds himself surrounded by external influences. The many wives he took didn't come alone. They brought with them their cultures, their beliefs, their gods. And Solomon, the wise king, begins to give in one small step at a time. First, he allows small rituals in the name of tolerance. Then, pagan altars start to appear, and before he knows it, Solomon, the very man who built the temple for the God of Israel, is participating in worship of foreign gods. The wisdom that once guided his decisions now seems distant, overshadowed by the choices he made in the name of politics and power. And in his heart, Solomon begins to feel the emptiness that no amount of wisdom or wealth can fill. He knew that the Lord had blessed him like no other man, yet he strayed. Now the consequences begin to surface, and the reign that started with so much promise, with a prayer for wisdom, begins to show the cracks of a heart divided between the true God and the idols that his alliances brought into Israel. But amidst all of this, Solomon still accomplishes one of the greatest works of his life: the construction of the temple. This temple, which had been his father David's dream, finally takes shape during Solomon's reign. It becomes the beating heart of Israel, the spiritual center where God's people come to worship, offer sacrifices, and connect with the Creator. Solomon spares no effort to ensure the temple is magnificent. He summons the finest craftsmen, imports the best materials, and oversees every detail of the work. When the temple is finally completed, it stands as a symbol of glory and majesty. The towering structure rises in the midst of Jerusalem, and its walls seem to breathe the presence of God. At the dedication ceremony, Solomon prays with fervor. Before the entire assembly of Israel, he lifts his hands to the heavens and cries out to God. His prayer is powerful, filled with acknowledgement of God's greatness and man's smallness. He asks that the Lord always hear the prayers made in that place, that his eyes always watch over the temple, day and night. Solomon knows that, no matter how grand the work of his hands, it cannot contain the vastness of God. Yet, he prays that the temple will be a place where heaven and earth meet. And God responds. His glory descends upon the temple, filling the place with a cloud so dense that the priests cannot continue their duties. It is a moment of deep spiritual impact for Israel. The people see, with their own eyes, that the Lord has approved the work and that he is present among them. For a moment, everything seems to be in place. Solomon has fulfilled his father's dream, brought the people of Israel closer to God, and the temple, that monumental work, becomes the symbol of a blessed reign. But at the same time, as the temple rises, something inside Solomon begins to crumble. Because despite everything, his soul is no longer fully there. As he dedicates the temple to the Lord, his heart starts to drift, torn between worshiping God and the commitments he made to foreign gods. The temple of stone and gold is complete, but the spiritual temple within Solomon slowly begins to fall apart. And so, the man who built God's house on earth finds himself gradually living in a house divided within himself. While the magnificent temple gleams under the Jerusalem sun, Solomon silently sinks into a web of alliances that pull him further away from God. His political decisions become personal traps. Marriages with foreign princesses, initially seen as strategies to strengthen the kingdom, bring not only diplomatic ties but also spiritual influences that begin to erode the king's heart. These women come from distant lands: Moabites, Ammonites, Sidonians, Egyptians, each with their own beliefs, traditions, and, most dangerously, their own gods. And, as much as Solomon tries to keep his focus on Yahweh, the pressure to please his wives becomes irresistible. The man blessed with wisdom to discern right from wrong starts making exceptions in the name of marital and political peace. At first, small altars appear in the far corners of Jerusalem. It won't hurt, Solomon thinks, but these small compromises open the door to larger concessions. Soon, the altars are no longer so hidden. Solomon allows these foreign gods' worship to become more visible, and what started as an act of tolerance turns into a dangerous indulgence. He finds himself occasionally participating in rituals he never imagined. The king who once fervently prayed before God now kneels in pagan ceremonies, conducted in the name of diplomacy and love. With each step he takes, a part of his soul drifts further from the God who blessed him at the beginning of his reign. And so, a cycle of immorality begins to spread throughout the kingdom. Solomon's example, the wisest king of all time, is followed not only by his courtiers but by all the people of Israel. Altars to strange gods spring up across the land, and what was once a nation dedicated to the Lord is now divided, with hearts pulled in opposing directions. Solomon, the man who started his reign with so much promise, now finds himself trapped in the web of his own choices. He knows what is right, but the power of these alliances and the pressure from his wives push him further from God. Little by little, the heart of the world's wisest king becomes a spiritual battlefield, where true devotion and the temptation to please others clash each day. Over time, Solomon's heart, once devoted to the Lord, is no longer the same. The voices of his many wives, each demanding attention and devotion to their own gods, begin to drown out the voice of God in his life. What began as small compromises quickly turns into something far more serious. The same Solomon who once built the Lord's temple in all its grandeur now erects pagan altars on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. He constructs a shrine for Chemosh, the abominable god of the Moabites, and another for Molech, the feared god of the Ammonites, whose rituals involve human sacrifices. These gods, which represent everything opposed to the God of Israel, now have altars built by the very man chosen to lead God's people. The impact is devastating. The people, who once followed their king's example in worshiping the Lord, are now divided. Many begin to worship these foreign gods, and the nation that was supposed to be holy and set apart for the Lord becomes immersed in idolatry. The line between God's people and the surrounding nations becomes blurred, and God, who had appeared to Solomon twice, is deeply grieved. The covenant he made with Solomon has been broken, and the consequences begin to loom on the horizon. In his mercy, God doesn't completely tear the kingdom away from Solomon, but he issues a clear warning. Because of the king's disobedience, the kingdom will be divided after his death. Part of it will be given to his servant, and only a small portion will remain with his son, out of love for David and for Jerusalem. Solomon begins to feel the weight of his choices. Enemies start to rise at Israel's borders, and the once prosperous and peaceful kingdom begins to unravel. Both internal and external adversaries turn against him. The glory of his reign, which once seemed unshakable, is now stained by idolatry and his departure from God. And so, the wisest king in history, who began his reign with so much promise, finds himself in his later years facing the consequences of a divided heart. The God who blessed him with wisdom, wealth, and honor now confronts him with the bitter reality of his choices, and the kingdom he built begins to crumble before his eyes. As the years pass, Solomon, now old, looks back at everything he has built. The grand temple, the magnificent palaces, the fortified cities, the vast wealth he accumulated. He was, without a doubt, the most powerful and prosperous man of his time. But in his heart, Solomon begins to feel an emptiness that all his accomplishments can't seem to fill. He realizes that despite all his wisdom and achievements, something crucial slipped through his fingers along the way. The pursuit of happiness and satisfaction through power, luxury, and pleasures didn't bring him the peace he expected. The laughter that once filled the halls of his palace now feels hollow and forced. The banquets seem meaningless, and the wealth that was once a source of pride now feels like a burden without purpose. Solomon, the man who had everything the human heart could desire, begins to question the true value of his achievements. He understands that luxury, parties, and pleasure cannot satisfy the deepest longing of his soul. Everything is fleeting. Everything is vanity. He reflects on his life and writes his conclusions in the book of Ecclesiastes. There, he reveals the frustrations and disillusionment he experienced in seeking happiness in earthly things. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, Solomon writes. He, who had tasted every pleasure the world could offer, now understands that true joy doesn't come from possessions or power, but from something much greater, something he had neglected in his relentless search for meaning. The luxury that once surrounded him, the ivory palaces, the lush gardens, all the things the world envied, now seem empty and hollow. The wisest king in history realizes that without God at the center of his life, all that he built was like chasing the wind. And so, Solomon, the man who began his journey asking for wisdom, ends his life with a bitter reflection. The wisdom he received was wasted in many moments as he pursued vanities that pulled him away from the true purpose of his existence. Amid these reflections, Solomon seeks to pass on what he has learned from his experiences, trying to salvage some value from all he has lived through. He turns to the wisdom that God gave him at the beginning of his reign and begins to share his teachings with the world. From this attempt to find meaning in the midst of his disappointments, the Proverbs are born brief yet profound lessons that encapsulate the wisdom of an entire lifetime. In Proverbs, Solomon becomes the mentor his people need. He offers advice on every aspect of life, from how to behave before kings to how to avoid the seduction of sin, with lessons on work, justice, and family along the way. Each proverb is a small gem of practical wisdom, shaped by the experience of a man who has seen both the best and the worst of the world. But as Solomon teaches others, he also seems to be trying to teach himself. He warns of the dangers of pride, excess, and lack of control over one's desires, mistakes he knows all too well, having lived through them. It's as if each proverb is a reminder of the choices he should have made, the paths he should have taken. For Solomon, Proverbs becomes a way to redeem, at least in part, what was lost over the years. He wants others to learn from his lessons so they won't fall into the same traps. There's an urgency in his writing, as if he's trying to leave behind a legacy of wisdom before it's too late, before everything falls apart. And so, despite his downfall and failures, Solomon manages, in some way, to perpetuate the divine wisdom given to him. His proverbs become a heritage that spans generations, a guide for those seeking to live a just and prudent life. Even though he failed in many ways, his wisdom lives on, echoing through the centuries, offering guidance to those who wish to avoid the same mistakes he made. Yet, even as Solomon writes his proverbs and shares his wisdom with the world, the weight of his choices continues to accumulate. The kingdom he ruled with such splendor begins to crumble, fragmenting under the pressure of his own mistakes. As the years pass, Solomon watches as what was once a united and prosperous kingdom becomes increasingly unstable. The people who once revered him for his wisdom now begin to question his decisions. The taxes needed to support the luxury of his palace and grand construction projects weigh heavily on the shoulders of his subjects, and discontent spreads across the tribes of Israel. Moreover, the political alliances he formed through his many foreign marriages brought not only strange gods into Israel but also diplomatic problems. Neighboring nations, which once respected and feared Solomon's power, now saw opportunities to rebel against Israelite domination. And, as God had warned, adversaries began to rise. First, Hadad the Edomite, whom Solomon thought he had completely eliminated, rises again against him. Then, Rezin from Damascus, who gathers an army and continually harasses Israel. These enemies, once kept at bay by Solomon's strength and wisdom, now become a constant threat to the kingdom's peace and security. But perhaps the most dangerous threat of all comes from within. Jeroboam, a young trusted official, rebels against Solomon. Encouraged by a prophecy that he would rule over a part of Israel, Jeroboam begins to gain support among the people, promising relief from the oppression that Solomon's reign had imposed. The kingdom, once a symbol of God's blessing, now stands on the brink of internal division, and Solomon, now old and weary, realizes that his legacy will not be that of a king whose reign brought eternal peace and prosperity, but of someone whose fall led to the ruin of the kingdom he had worked so hard to build. Solomon's final years are marked by this bitter reality. He knows that after his death, Israel will never be the same. The tribes will divide, and the unified kingdom that David, his father, had fought so hard to establish, will be torn apart. The end of his life brings with it the end of an era of glory for Israel, and Solomon is forced to confront the fact that his choices led him to this point. A kingdom in ruins, where God's glory has been replaced by idolatry and discord. And so, the wisest king in history ends his days in sorrow, knowing that the price of his disobedience will be paid by future generations. With the weight of the consequences of his choices on his shoulders, Solomon turns to a deeper reflection on life. He is no longer the young king full of promise. Now, with a weary heart and eyes turned toward the end of his journey, he writes what may be his most introspective work, the Book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon pours out his anxieties and questions about life. He examines everything he has achieved, everything he has experienced, and concludes that under the sun all is vanity. He, who had access to all the pleasures and wisdom the world could offer, now finds himself facing a deep emptiness, a sense that everything he pursued was, in the end, like chasing after the wind. Solomon describes how he tried everything: the pursuit of knowledge, laughter, pleasures, and wealth. He threw himself into grand constructions, hard work, and the creation of a vast empire. But in the end, he realizes that none of it brought the lasting satisfaction he expected. Everything was fleeting, everything passed, like sand slipping through his fingers. This realization hits Solomon hard. The man who had everything realizes that without God, nothing truly matters. Knowledge, power, pleasure, none of it can give life meaning. In a moment of pure honesty, he confesses that, in the end, all these things left him empty. He looks back at what he built and the choices he made and recognizes that without the constant presence of God, life is a meaningless pursuit. What once seemed so important now disintegrates in the light of truth. He writes, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come." Ecclesiastes is a call to realism, a warning that no matter how much we try to find meaning in the things of this world, only in God do we find true purpose. In the final years of his life, Solomon tries to pass this lesson on to those still at the beginning of their journey. He knows that time is short, that worldly pursuits are fleeting, and that without God, none of it makes sense. Thus, Ecclesiastes becomes the testament of the wisest king in the world, a melancholic yet sincere warning so that others do not repeat his mistakes. Now, with all his life experience, Solomon points to the Creator as the only true source of contentment and meaning. And so, Solomon reaches the end of his journey, carrying the weight of everything he lived and what he left undone. The man who began with so much potential ends his life with a mixture of regret and hard-earned wisdom. Now, his mind returns to the beginning, when everything was still in his hands, when God gave him the opportunity to walk in faithfulness. He remembers that night when God appeared to him in a dream, offering him a blank check and his choice for wisdom. He also remembers the promises God made, that if he remained faithful, his reign would be long and prosperous, and his descendants would continue to rule Israel. But he also recalls the warning: if he strayed, if he abandoned the ways of the Lord, the consequences would be devastating. And that is exactly what happened. In his moments of weakness, Solomon allowed his heart to drift away from God, and now he faces the consequences of that disobedience. Yet, he knows that God is still faithful. Though his own reign is nearing its end, though the kingdom of Israel is on the verge of division and the glory he built is crumbling, Solomon acknowledges that God has not abandoned his promise. Out of love for David, God will not completely destroy the kingdom. There will still be one tribe for his son, a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption for the people of Israel. And so, in the final days of his life, Solomon returns to what is essential. He turns to God with a humble heart, knowing that despite his failures, God's mercy is still present. He realizes that the true legacy he can leave behind is not his wealth, his power, or even the grand temple he built. What truly matters is the relationship with God, the Creator, the one who gives life its meaning. In the end, Solomon leaves a message for all of us: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. He knows that in the final judgment, everything will be brought to light, both the good and the bad. And he hopes that his experience will serve as a guide, so that others may choose a more faithful path and avoid the traps that led him away from God. Thus, the great king, who began with so much promise and ended with so much reflection, finishes his journey with a silent prayer in his heart, that those who come after him may learn from his failures, seek God with all their hearts, and find in the divine presence the true purpose and peace that he, so often, lets slip away.